So we're looking at the recruiter dashboard for expert hire. And here's where you can see all the companies that we're currently recruiting for. You can go into the companies. This is a more in-depth view with a small description for each companies that we've already created. If we're onboarding a new company, we can do that over here. Name of the company, description, and a logo for an identifier. I'm just going to go over to the expert hire. We already have 5 jobs created over here. And for the sake of this demo, I'm going to create a new job. And that could be for a Python software engineer Flask. And the location could just be San Francisco. And language can be English. We have English, Japanese, and French. We do support 107 languages. Job description, if you have it in handy, you can just copy paste the data over here, or you can just generate with our inbuilt AI, and it'll generate a job description for Python software engineer Flask, and it's a rich text editor, and we can just go ahead and edit everything. Moving on to the next step, we made it very simple to add requirements for the skills, right? What are the must-haves and what are the nice-to-haves? So a must-have for this is going to be Flask. Let's say it's a NoSQL setup, so MongoDB, and we want to go ahead with DynamoDB also. They're doing a migration from MongoDB to DynamoDB, and Redis is required. Let's say Elasticsearch. And a nice to have would be, okay, if not for Redis or Elasticsearch, Search, something they've worked on. If not Flask, at least Flask API. So that would be nice to have, right? Maybe AWS, because this is just for a developer. If they have some AWS or DevOps experience, that would be nice. And this should be on Kubernetes, right? Something like this. And we can just go on. And now what is happening is the platform is going to be generating domain level questions, right? It's questions that are, hey, how do you create a REST API in Flask, or what sort of REST API architecture do we use, and so on and so forth. So we can just go through a couple questions over here. In a real-world scenario, the application requires processing and querying large data sets in a database. What factors would you consider when deciding whether to use MongoDB or DynamoDB or Redis for storing and accessing devices? So these are all like verbal questions that the candidate can answer. We can select all. And as a recruiter, if I want to ask very specific questions, I can do that over here too. And once I've created the job, we go in over here, we create our first round. We can look through the job that we've created step by step. Moving on to the round, there are a couple things that we can do immediately. We can select the round type. Resume screening, do we want it to be a resume only round, right? Am I expecting 20, 30, 40, 100, a million applicants? Then I can just do that over here. I'll start with the resume screening round, which is very straightforward. I can add a candidate. I can add a candidate by email. So I'm just going to add a sample candidate over here with their email, and that's been added. The candidate gets an option to upload their own resume through an email, but because I have the candidate's resume handy, I can just do that myself. And it's going to take a couple seconds to process, and I'll show you what the reporting looks like for that. So the platform has analyzed the candidate for all the skill sets that we mentioned, right? And why it's given a particular score, DynamoDB. So this candidate has used DynamoDB extensively across multiple projects, L&D and CMS, worked with Elasticsearch on multiple projects, Slack Analytics Dashboard, CMS. And at a quick glance, we see the resume strengths, resume weaknesses, and the missing keywords for, in the resume. Like none of these are explicitly mentioned, right? And we can also view the resume of the candidate, right? Just for it to be quick. And here in tech stacks, we've mentioned like AWS Suite, that's been mentioned over here. DevOps experience has been mentioned. Elasticsearch has been mentioned, and so on, right? And that's what we see in the reports also. So we can choose to shortlist the candidate, and the recruiter can also add notes, right? Just in case multiple people are working on that particular candidate and this particular job. Okay, so we'll start by creating a new round. This time it can be an AI interview round, and this can just be a text screening round. Moving on to the round configuration, we can set the difficulty level, right? The very hard mode is when the bot is going to ask a lot of follow-up questions based on the resume, based on the previous projects, and all their answers. It's going to prod and dig deeper. So let me do a medium interview for the sake of this demo. We can select any of these. HR round is going to be like negotiations, salary, culture fit. The coding round is more of a paired coding question, where the questions are more job related and not DSA. Problem solving or aptitude, this is a very interesting round. It's going to be like guesstimate type of questions. How many tennis balls can you fit into a Boeing 747? Or any of those, or like how long do you think a snail is going to take to potentially climb a hill or something like that, right? Any of those questions. Analytical design is domain specific. These are going to be questions. This is a round exclusively for non-tech roles, or even tech roles. It's completely fine. This will become a system design type of interview. And for non-tech roles, this will dig deeper into their domain and the tools that are required for the particular role. So I'll do a coding round for this. Non-negotiables is straightforward. It's like, again, it's non-negotiables. Are you okay working from office 5 days a week, right? So that's a non-negotiable. We want the candidate to say yes. If they say no, we don't want to waste the candidate's time, and we can just let them know that it's an important aspect for this particular job, and we cannot proceed with you. And the questions we're generating now are for this particular round. So since we selected coding round, so the questions are going to be coding based. Expertise uses Redis as a caching layer to reduce database load, fetching frequently, access candidate profiles, implement a mechanism that checks the cache first before querying the database if the profile is not in cache. So we can select a few questions. Again, just like on the job level, we can add our own questions here if you want. What we can also do is we don't have to add the candidate again. We can just go over here. We can shortlist the candidate, and the candidate should automatically have been moved to round 2, right? And since we already have the candidate's resume analyzed, so we're just waiting on the interview analysis. And for that bit, let's just schedule the interview. Let me pick 12:30 a.m. and the interview's been scheduled. So now we're looking at the candidate POV. The candidate gets an email saying they've been added to an interview at XYZ time, along with a calendar invite, so they're constantly reminded if it's set to earn a later date or much later time. We do some preliminary checks just to understand that they're interviewing from their laptops or their PC, and network speeds, and all of that. The candidate can select their microphones, their cameras, anything that they want, and they can just join it.
Flask role at Expert Hire. I'm Ethan, and I'm looking forward to seeing how you approach problems through code. Before we dive in, I'd like to go through a few quick checks so we're aligned on expectations. Shall we begin?
Yeah, sure, let's begin.
Great. To start off, are you okay working from the office 5 days a week?
Yes, I'm okay with that.
All right, thanks for confirming that. Now that it's out of the way, let's begin. Can you start by giving me a brief introduction about yourself, your background, journey, and your current focus?
I've been working as a Python software engineer and with Flask for the last 16 years. I've worked on different tech stacks, worked on a lot of projects that have led end to end. I've implemented both SQL, NoSQL databases, integrations. I've built a caching layer with Redis. I've worked on VectorDB, Quadrant, ES, and primarily my focus has been in developing backend APIs, RESTful architecture with Flask.
Got it. Sounds like you've got a strong foundation and a lot of hands-on experience with the techs we're looking for. Let's dive into evaluating some specific skills now. Starting with Flask, can you walk me through how you would structure a medium-sized Flask application to ensure it's modular and maintainable?
So what I typically like doing is I like following a blueprint architecture where I'm going to have a main.py file, and in the main.py file, I'm going to register separate blueprints. So it's a medium-sized application, so I'm assuming there's a dashboard, If there's one, and there's going to be a client-side application, maybe there's an admin-side application, so I'd probably split these three and into different blueprints. I'm going to handle individual, like auth is going to be its own blueprint. The individual routes are going to be handled like that. The routes are going to be defined on the API level, on the blueprints itself. Then I'll have handlers that do most of the processing. And anytime there's, like, let's say an SES integration or an SNS integration, any sort of utilities, I'd pick it up from the utils file. So that's sort of how I'd go about structuring it. Personally, sometimes I'd also like to put it in a wsgi.py file just to run it with Unicorn directly on the library level instead of the Unicorn command.
Okay, I see. Using blueprints for modularity is definitely a good approach, especially as the app scales. Let me ask, how would you manage shared configurations or global variables across multiple blueprints in the app? How would you avoid potential conflicts or unintended side effects?
So Flask inbuilt has a global variable on its own. It's called G that you can just import from Flask. You can just do from Flask import G. And any sort of client that I initialize on the app level, I can just put that on a global variable. And I just use that across all my shared utils. I can do that.
Ah, I see where you're coming from with using the G object for share data. Makes sense for storing things tied to the active request lifecycle, like a database client. But what about cases involving persistent configs or variables that aren't tied to a request? How would you safely handle those? For example, something the entire app can depend on?
So in that case, I'd use a config file or settings, and I'd essentially just import all my constants and env variables that I have that I want to access, like db URLs, db passwords, any third-party URLs, third-party API keys, and I'd probably persist on a config file, and I can access that config. I can import that config file into, or a class, a data class of just all of these config variables into any of the files that I'll be working with, and I can just use that everywhere else.
Got it. Leveraging a centralized configuration file or data class for environment variables and constants is definitely a solid approach for global configuration. It keeps things consistent and avoids duplication. How do you handle the secure storage of sensitive information, like that DB password or API keys, especially when deploying to production?
So I use a python.env and I load an env file. Um, and that's the way I keep everything secure. .env I don't want to push to Git, so I'd probably put that into git ignore, and I usually just have a .env file for every application that I'm working with.
Yeah, using a env file and environment variables for sensitive data is good. Keeps it out of source control, which is key. Have you used any secret management services like AWS Secrets Manager or HashiCorp Vault for an
I
extra layer
have
of security?
Yes, I have used AWS Secrets Manager with a lifecycle, so key rotations and everything that we have for sensitive data, we manage through that, and I have done that in the past.
Right? Managing sensitive data lifecycle like key rotation through tools like AWS Secrets Manager definitely adds robustness, especially in production. Nice. Now let's transition to the coding challenge. Implement a Flask API to search for job listings stored in an Elasticsearch index. The API should support multi-field searches by job title, location, and company name. Ensure the search is paginated and returns results sorted by relevance.
Okay.
Open your coding.
So what I'm gonna do is from Flask, I'm gonna import Flask first, and let's say I also want to import Jsonify. And I want to define the Flask app, and for that I'll just do flask.name. Uh, and let's say I also want cores, right? So I want to enable cores from Flask cores, import cores. I think it's all caps. Let's assign that to the app. if I don't do anything to it, if I just leave it as course of app, then it pretty much just allows our origins. I'm going to leave it like that for now. Let's space it out a little bit. And within that, let me define the first route, app.route, and I can do, let's say, a search route, right? And I want this to be methods where I want to allow post, because this is going to be a post route itself. Define search products, and within that, I'm going to take the payload. Payload would be request dot payload. I also want to import requests into this request, and even JSON maybe. I need JSON, so I could just do this instead. I'll rename that variable. I'll rename payload to data, just to avoid conflicts. So JSON dot, let's say, loads request of payload. That'll give me all the data and all the query that we want to implement, right? So you mentioned that it was in ES or DynamoDB. So I'm also going to have a DynamoDB utils. So let's say from utils, import Dynamo utils. I'm not going to write the entire utils file. So for the sake of this, let's say, because we want it to be paginated, I'm just going to get response, and let's just say Dynamo utils dot get paginated query, get paginated response with get paginated response, and within that I'll just pass, let's say, data of query, right? And then what I do is I'll probably just return JSONify of response as is. So yeah, that's my answer.
Got it. So your approach involves 1. Setting up the Flask app. You imported and initialized Flask along with CORS for handling cross-origin requests, keeping it open to all origins for now. 2. Defining the search route. This route is designed for post requests, where it will handle incoming searches. 3. Fetching the query payload, using request, JSON, or request. Payload converted via JSON. Loads, to gather the data required for your Elasticsearch query. 4. Pagination via Dynamo utils. You build a utility function, getPaging, for managing paginated responses. However, you didn't quite complete its integration with Elasticsearch to perform the actual multi-field search or implement sorting by relevance. While you've set up the basics well, the functionality to query Elasticsearch
Yeah,
and
I don't know how to
handle
do that, I'm sorry.
No worries. I appreciate your honesty. Let's mark this task here, and we'll move forward. It's okay to get stuck. Part of the job is learning how to handle challenges. Shall we continue?
Yes, please.
All right, let's dive into some technical knowledge questions next. Consider that the application you're building must utilize caching for frequently accessed read operations on interview data. How would you design and implement such a caching mechanism using Redis in a Flask ecosystem?
So I just create a cache layer with Redis where all sort of DB responses, mostly GET requests, I like caching. So frequently accessed routes along with queries and the responses, I'm going to put it on Redis as a key value pair. For every request before querying the DB, I'm going to check with Redis to see if that particular query key exists, and if there's a value, I'm just going to put it there. In case of a DB updation, I'll invalidate the cache, and as is, the TTL is going to be pretty tiny. So if it's been, for example, let's say 5 minutes, then the cache gets invalidated itself.
Okay, that's a solid outline. Quick follow-up. How would you approach cache invalidation for update-heavy operations to maintain data consistency?
So every time there's an update, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to query on the basis of what fields are being updated. If there's any field in Redis with that has been cached that I'm going to be updating. I'm going to invalidate all of those and just kill those records.
Got it. So you're essentially invalidating specific keys tied to the update. Makes sense. How would you ensure this process is performant and doesn't slow down the system, especially as the data scales up?
I'm going to multi-thread it, right? Ideally, if it's an update heavy operation, I'm going to run the cache invalidation on a separate thread, and then I'm going to do the updation. Hopefully, cache updation, because it's on Redis and it's in memory, it's going to be pretty quick, because we don't want any false positives and like invalid data being shown to somebody else.
All right, running cache invalidation on a separate thread is a solid approach for offloading the processing and prioritizing memory speed with Redis checks out. If this were a distributed system with multiple processes accessing the cache, how would you handle ensuring consistency across nodes while keeping performance intact?
So what I'd probably do is, from the master node, whatever node is going to be updating the cache, I'll probably just initially just write a blocker saying just cache being invalidated. I'd probably track it with a key saying cache invalidation process ongoing, just for the other nodes to know that cache is being invalidated or cache is being worked on right now. So all the data in cache is not reliable, and it can't really fetch it from cache.
Got it. So you're essentially using a locking mechanism to avoid stale reads during invalidation. Makes sense. Would you use any specific distributed locking mechanism or library for this?
Not that I know of. I've done this in the past. I've just built my own logic.
All right, makes sense. Custom logic can work well if crafted carefully. Have you encountered any challenges or pitfalls when implementing this approach, like deadlocks or performance bottlenecks? If so, how did you address them?
I have encountered deadlocks before, and that was primarily because I was not locking the mechanism properly. And it's pretty easy to figure out. I just run it through a debugger, try to understand where the deadlock is happening, what is causing it in the distributed system. Just it's a lot of log searching and debugging. And once you figure it out, make sure it never happens again.
Got it. Debugging and logging are definitely valuable here. When you fix the issue, did you implement any specific measures, like timeout for locks or changes to the sequence of operations, to ensure that deadlocks wouldn't occur again?
I did make changes to the sequence of operations. Apart from that, I didn't have to mess around with the timeout. Sorry.
All right, makes sense. Adjusting operation sequences often does the trick. Thanks for explaining. Let's move forward. Any other questions about the role or organization?
Yeah, so I want to know what my day-to-day would look like in the company and what I'd be doing at Expert Hire.
Great question. In this role, your day-to-day would involve building and maintaining backend solutions using Python and Flask. You'd spend time designing and developing scalable and secure REST APIs, while also integrating databases like
Is
Mongo.
it just Flask, or will there also be Fast API, Django, and other things?
Good point. While the primary focus is Flask, there might be opportunities to work with other frameworks like Fast API or Django, depending on specific projects or your preferences. But predominantly, this role is centered around Flask. Does that align with what you're looking for?
Absolutely, that sounds amazing. I have nothing else.
Great. Thank you for your time and for sharing your insights today. Good luck on and in the next steps moving forward. Would you like me to end the interview?
Yes, please. So yeah, that was the interview. And from the recruiter side, the recruiter during ongoing interviews, they could also just listen in to the entire conversation that's happened. But now this interview would show up as processing, and this typically takes about 5 to 6 minutes for the entire video to process, and we can take a look at the reports once it's done. The interview has been processed, and the recruiter can now go through the entire interview at a quick glance with candidate performance score, are they a good fit for the role, and why.
Welcome
They
to the
also get
coding
to
round for the
see
Python
the
software
entire
engineer.
interview.
And const.
Can skip to any part of the interview. There's a face preview of the person, the candidate that's actually interviewing, a full-fledged transcript, all sorts of events that we detected. The candidate switched tabs twice. There's someone else in the room, right? We do a diarization on the audio also. There were multiple monitors that the candidate was using, so they could potentially be cheating. So these are all like all sorts of events and information that we can give out to the recruiter, and along with the resume score that's already been captured in the past. A full-fledged summary with the first part just obviously being the non-negotiable, followed by like a quick summary with a prompt-wise recap and actual question to answer, and the score for each of those questions. In addition to that, from the interview, everything that's been inferred, all the things that have been spoken about in the interview, and has experience with AWS Secrets Manager. That's something the candidate spoke about during the interview, and the must-haves and why that is. Field knowledge evaluation, like these are all things that are not part of the must-have skills, but the additional stuff that's been inferred from the video, like Redis caching, was not mentioned over here. But again, they spoke about it, distribution casting, good consistency, Flask application architecture, that's pretty good. Behavior analysis, like where was that eye contact, where were they looking, where they composed, did they have good posture, and the communication, right? Was it clear? Was it understandable? Were they being coherent? And those are all things. The submission, the code snippet, right, that the candidate had submitted along with code score analysis on why the particular score has been given, and all of these combined is the final score, and now the recruiter can choose to either shortlist or reject the candidate.